Hello viewers, and welcome yet again to another episode of Know Your Laws. Here we talk on matters to do with law, justice and legal affairs, and as usual we always inform you, help you and learn new laws. And this week we want to talk about the tenancy law. The relation between the tenant and the landlord is one that has been causing different scenarios, and most of them end up in the court corridors. But what does the law talk about in regards to the tenancy law? That is what we are going to discuss in this episode as well. And to have that discussion is my guest, who is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya, Bruno Situma. Welcome again to the program.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's always my pleasure to be here.
And this time around, talking about something that is relatable to both me, you, and the viewer, that is the tenancy law.
Everyone.
Which is very touching to each and every person, because kila mtu, they live in a place. But let's begin here. What does the tenancy law of the Republic of Kenya talk about in regards to the relation between the tenant and the landlord?
I think, as a matter of fact, I usually, when it comes to tenancy law, I usually point out the fact that a lot of effort has been put by Parliament and the legislation bodies to legislate on matters relating to commercial tenancies. Mm-hmm. However, when it comes to private tenancies, the tenancy that you and me have in our houses, mm-hmm. It's a bit of a gray area, so not so much has been done with effect to that. And most of the time, there is a problem where you find that the normal tenant in his house has to rely on some provisions that touch on commercial tenancies to get their way around the law. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's something that really, I would say, is a gray area in the law. But mm-hmm. we have enough laws to govern tenancies, and the most important that we look at is, of course, the law of contracts. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you've talked about the commercial tenancy and the private tenancy. Private tenancy, what is the difference between the two of them, just so as we get started?
So if I would say, for example, if you want to lease a space to run a hotel property, mm-hmm. the laws that govern that are very clear. They have been set out. For example, I would say the Landlord and Tenants Hotel and Catering Establishments Act. Mm-hmm. We have the Registered Lands Act, which govern all those aspects of the law. Mm-hmm. Laws such as the Distress for Rent Act. So when it comes to commercial tenancies, you have taken a shop or you are running a hotel for purposes of conducting business. The law is more or less very clear. Now, when it comes to the house that you and I occupy as our private residences, mm-hmm. especially the houses that I would call the lower class houses, those ones where you pay more than, the middle class houses, not necessarily the lower class houses, the middle class houses where you pay more than 2,300 shillings. Mm-hmm. Most of it is usually an issue of relying on the laws that provide for business establishment and business establishments and having them applied to suit the situation. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
as you talk about, the private tenancy, yes. Being able to rely on the commercial set laws to be able to come into a conclusion. First of all, there are most of the disputable elements in the tenancy lie at the private level. You find not so much in the commercial side where there is a conflict, but the conflict comes into the private part of it. Someone has rented an apartment, say, and now they find themselves in the loggerheads with the landlord. So at that point, where does now the law apply?
Like I said, most of those issues are usually dealt with in a manner that takes what happens in the commercial scenario. Mm-hmm. And by the way, unlike what you said that we have disputes in private properties, mm-hmm. we have a lot of disputes in commercial properties, sometimes mm-hmm. even more than private properties. Okay. Most of them arising from a lack of following process. Mm-hmm. Of course, for private properties, it's usually issues to do with deposit, refund of deposit, non-payment of rent. What else? I think sometimes disputes relating to quiet possession or privacy, invasion of privacy. Sometimes you have landlords who are so invasive. They want to visit your house every time. Perhaps issues to do with security, assuming somebody has broken into your house and stolen goods. Those are the kind of things that we see in private tenancies. And most of them, for example, if you look at the issue of deposits, let me just take that as an example. If you look at the issue of deposits in private property, most of it will be resolved by reading at the contract and then saying what rights does the landlord have under the contract and what rights does the tenant have under the contract. Then the courts will always reconcile that and find a middle ground, right? If we are to look at things such as non-payment of rent, the first point of thought that comes to my mind is the Distress for Rent Act, which basically allows the landlord to distress for rent and ask an auctioneer to come to your house and perhaps sell your goods or your house goods so that they can recover their rent, which is a very different process if we were to look at commercial premises, for example. Yeah.
And let's focus more on the private tenancy, because that is what most people get into loggerheads with, because you find someone wants to move out after some time and then the landlord has a different opinion, and there is also a contract that binded them. Are there significant rights of the tenant that are publicly addressed in various acts of the tenancy law? Are there some of the significant?
I think the first bit that I would advise the viewer, and this is something that a lot of people overlook. Remember that when you are getting into a private tenancy for your private dwelling, as much as you need the house, the landlord also needs a client, right? So what usually happens, unfortunately, is we find a lot of people who are given a contract and they just sign. Just put their signature without reading what the landlord has put into that contract, without knowing that they actually have the right to negotiate that contract. So that if the landlord says rent is payable by 5th, you actually have the right to say, no, I want to negotiate this to make it 10th. Because that 5th is what will make him penalize you in the next 2 months, right? When perhaps you were able to pay on 10th. So people don't read these contracts. People don't seek legal advice on these contracts. People just sign those contracts and get into those buildings. When sometimes the landlord has said, when it comes to deposit, for example, I will not refund deposit unless you return the houses in their original position, which is their right under the law, right? It is their right that they can retain deposit for as long as you have not returned the premises back to the original position. But then what some people don't see is they don't foresee that if the premises are to be returned to the original position, for example, it ought to be what can I call it? It ought to be they ought to work together. It's not an issue of the landlord deciding that I want this person to come and work in this house, and those are some of the things that you can argue in your contract. But that notwithstanding, I think if I were to go back to what you asked, the biggest problems that I see with landlords are issues to do with deposit and privacy, and rent and distress for rent.
Distress for rent. And talked about the tenant being able to understand the contract and being able to understand what the law and the agreement they've had wants him or her to do. But then there is also the other part of the landlord, like he has some rights that are stipulated that he can be able to do in terms of eviction, recovering of rent through auctioneers and all that. For the landlord, does the tenancy laws and acts favor him? Because most of the time to find it's the tenant would now sit on top of the landlord, despite the property being owned by the landlord.
Yeah, I don't think I would say that they favor anyone. What I would just say is usually it's a lack of it's a problem of not seeking advice. Not seeking advice when not seeking advice with regard to what the law is actually. So for example, I would give an example of evictions. Most people don't know that the landlord cannot evict you without giving you notice. And that notice must be in prescribed form, right? So they don't just write a letter to you. There's a way they use, there's a specific document that the law provides that the landlord needs to fill up before they're able to evict you. So if they don't fill that document, for example, that is when you start thinking that tenants have now become very difficult to deal with, right? But if you come to me as an advocate and they're trying to evict you and I look at it and I just see a letter, then all I would say is that this letter is not recognizable before the law, because the Landlord and Tenants Shops and Hotel Establishments Act provides that you must use the form that has been put in that act. Nothing more, nothing less, right? So it's about plucking it off or downloading it from printing out that page and filling in the details. That is what ought to happen. So if as a landlord you don't follow that, then you will be saying this tenant has refused to be evicted. Perhaps you need to give notice period, sufficient notice period. Maybe you've not given the sufficient notice period. And that's why, for example, you are seeing very bad, sometimes back, I don't know whether it was during the COVID period. I'm sure you saw it in the news that some landlord had to actually use very uncouth means in some apartments in Langata to evict people there. So that he had to make the place basically uninhabitable. So such a landlord is somebody who has not read the law. They don't know how to go about it, right? You don't have to do what that guy did with sewage before you're able to evict your tenant. If you follow the law, you should be able to go through the process successfully.
And what are the consequences now if now the eviction is done illegally? Maybe the landlord has proceeded to evict a tenant illegally. Like for a tenant would say that would not be able to understand whether the landlord has evicted him or her illegally, but in real sense the landlord has done that illegally. So in that case, what are the consequences for the landlord?
As a landlord, you actually face the danger of being sued for damages. And sometimes it becomes more expensive than if you had just followed process and say paid an advocate and sorted it out. So I would say that if, for example, a tenant comes to me and says, assuming, let me just use the example on Langata Road again. This is a landlord who has, let me say, 20, 30 tenants, and each of them sues for just the equivalent of 1 month's rent. You see, that becomes quite an amount of money. Just assuming that they're paying 35,000 a month for 20 houses. If they sue and they're successful, and it is shown that you didn't follow process to evict them, certainly then as a landlord you're facing some substantial amount of money. Of course, without adding the legal costs, so you might think that you evicted them and you were the powerful one at that point, but you run the risk of being sued for breach of contract. Because remember again that when you sign that agreement, there are terms and conditions that each of you, both the landlord and the tenant, have to abide by.
And once you sue the landlord, perhaps, can the court, or rather can the justice system be able to establish that if indeed the landlord did wrong in proceeding to perhaps evict you or bring in some up and down for you to be able to stay there, is the court able, or rather in a position to, make a determination or rather ruling that this landlord did wrong and this is our ruling that you can stay there until this particular time?
Most of the time what happens is perhaps they would make that as an interim order or interim ruling. So that when you go to court, you say, this landlord is trying to force his way, he wants to evict me, I've been paying rent and I have not looked for somewhere to move to. So I want this court to stop him from evicting me, right? That perhaps would work. But at the end of the day, again, it's an issue of that the court cannot sit. It's very difficult to get to a situation where the court is forcing what we call specific performance. But that usually happens for commercial agreements, because most commercial agreements are signed for a long-term period. So perhaps in the private tenancy plan, not so much of that. But when you look at commercial leases, if you take this building and say, I want to start a hotel here, and you're told you're going to start it for, you're going to sign the contract for 1 year, then the landlord is bound by that provision that this tenancy is for a period of 1 year, and that if perhaps if it's renewable, then you'll have to give notice that I intend to renew, and then you'll renegotiate. But most of the time you'll find that in order to avoid what we call controlled tenancies, because controlled tenancies are tenancies that are for a period of not more than 5 years. So in 5 years and 3 months. So in order to avoid those situations, which usually require that, or sometimes those that are not written, those that are unwritten. In order to avoid those situations, you'll find most landlords giving you a tenancy of more than 5 years. If at year 1 they sit down and feel that you're making so much money and they can come in and perhaps take a hostage of that situation and make that money themselves, then in that case the court can make such a ruling and say, you can stay here until the 5-year period is exhausted, and then you can leave. And in that case, then you ought to pay rent to a specific place. And then now you will have a situation where we have a landlord and a tenant who don't see eye to eye, but who are in a tenancy relationship.
Don't we see that as a factor that the law sitting on top of the landlord, despite the property being owned by the landlord?
And that is where, again, I take you back to what I said earlier, that most people, even sometimes landlords, sometimes landlords are in the behavior of just going online and saying, I have seen an agreement here, I think let me download it and just give the tenant to sign. And then you find yourself giving a tenant a contract that provides that he'll be there for 5 years and 3 months. Or more, right? And of course at that point the landlord is saying, that is a nice time to have a tenant over those premises, because they're also thinking that I'll be making money at that point, right? Until they notice that that contract that you downloaded means you cannot evict this tenant for the 5 years for as long as they're paying rent and meeting their obligations. So then at that point, I don't think it will be correct to point out that that landlord amekaliwa, sindio? At that point, it will be correct to point out that the landlord did not look at the contract when they were signing it, or when they were letting the tenant get into the premises, right? Yeah. So one thing I would say first is, and I think I want to really emphasize this to the viewer, don't overlook the importance of a tenancy agreement. It is not just an agreement you sign and move on. It has consequences that ought to be met, and that is one of the things that a lot of people, including landlords, and I think for me, I would say that going by how you are defending landlords, I would say that it is more important for a landlord to actually seek legal advice, because they stand to suffer more
than the tenant.
Right? That the landlord stands to suffer more loss if they don't seek legal advice compared to the tenant, because then in that case it is a situation where they stand to suffer financial loss. Unlike a tenant who perhaps will just pack his things and move to the next.
Which is a very common scenario, especially during these tough economic times.
During these tough economic times, and especially for those people who are hosting universities. When we used to be in universities, there were times when we could just pack and leave the house without anybody knowing.
You just put in your padlock there, scarecrow.
Yes.
But again, there is another factor in regards to the tenancy law and the landlord-tenant relationship in regards to the rent increment. That is also a factor. regarding that. Most of the times you may find while you're getting in, there is no clause in the contract that suggests or rather insinuates or gives you the heads up that at some point we shall increase rent of this particular house. But then the landlord, out of prevailing circumstances, decides that it's time that I increase the rent of this house. But now the tenant, of course, and as usual, they love to rebel in that situation. So in that situation, is that a legal battle, or rather is the landlord entitled to his property and to charge what he wants for the property?
When it comes to increments, there are two things that we need to know. That first of all, increments cannot be made during a subsisting tenancy unless the tenancy is terminated.
Okay.
So that tenancy is terminated or comes to an end and you start a new tenancy. It's only at that point that you can increase. Unless you have made provisions in the contract that every certain period of time we will increase this rent by a specified amount. So perhaps you're saying this tenancy is for 1 year. Every 6 months we will increase rent by 500. That is allowed. That's allowed. Number two, the other option is to say this tenancy is for 1 year. At the end of 1 year, we will either terminate it or renew it. And when we renew it, we will renew it under terms that allow me to increase rent as a landlord. That is the only way you can increase rent as a landlord. If at all you don't follow that process, then it is impossible, it is illegal for you to try or attempt to increase rent.
I'm trying to look at a scenario where most people move into houses, rather into residential premises, and then someone doesn't set a limit of or rather in the contract there is no limit of how long they should stay there. You just get into the house and then you have started living in the house. Now
you can stay for as long as you want.
Notice.
Until further notice.
Yes. So now in between is when now the landlord decides, hey, we need to increase the rent of this particular premises, while in the contract there's no limit of when you would stay there. Is that also questionable?
Unfortunately for the landlord in that particular situation, they have no option. They cannot increase rent because the tenancy agreement does not make provisions for increasing rent. If, again by bad luck, the tenancy agreement has not made provisions for termination by giving notice, now that is a landlord who has a very bad client, especially if you find somebody who knows the law. I will stay in that building and 10 years down the line I'll still be paying the same rent I was paying when I got into that building.
Okay, regardless of even other people coming with different rents.
And at that point it will become very difficult for the landlord to terminate. And then that's why I say that especially if we have no provision for termination.
Okay.
But again, that is a problem for a landlord who did not ensure that his agreement protects his rights. Because a good landlord will say that every 1 year or 2 years we have inflation, right? So I have to take care of that. Don't be greedy. Get into that contract and say this contract is for 1 year renewable or 2 years renewable. After 2 years, the landlord will have the option to renew it or not. And while renewing, the landlord will have the option to increase rent, right? Now, in 2 years, you can go and say your tenancy has come to an end. Do you still want to continue staying in my house under new terms or not? If you don't want to meet the new terms, then you have to vacate the premises because the tenancy agreement has come to an end. So, I cannot insist more that both the landlord and the tenant ought to look at the tenancy agreement and ensure that it makes provisions for the kind of relationship they want to have. Because if it doesn't do that, then you are bound to find those problems. And I know of some people, actually I know of some people who are very close to me, that have stayed in a house somewhere in Eastlands for the last 13, 14 years. And the landlord is not able to increase rent because they didn't even enter into a tenancy agreement.
13 years ago, that must be a long time ago.
That must be a long time ago. Actually, 13 years is sometime about 2010.
2010.
Yes, when the late Mwai Kibaki was still president. And this guy has stayed in that house. And even when you look at the rent that he's paying, it is substantially lower than
any rent that is being paid at this
around,
moment.
yes, around the same area.
Okay.
And of course now he's happy and not willing to leave that house.
So that is a tenant gone wrong.
That's a tenancy gone wrong, and they happen, Chris.
Okay. I think that is also a very important point. But then, as we wind up, there is the issue of and definitely I know you've heard of it, sitting on the deposit, and then someone just decide, you won't return my deposit. Let me sit and then just leave your property. And then now the time of leaving, the landlord tells you, oh no, you cannot leave, regardless of you having a deposit. So as we wind up, let's talk about that.
I know the issue of deposit is usually very emotive.
Very,
because
it involves finances and all
Chris,
that.
before I became an advocate, I remember there is somebody who refused to return my deposit of 2,500, and I've never forgiven them to date. So it's something that I know is emotive. But what the law provides for is that the landlord has the right to request for deposit. That deposit can be used in three scenarios. First is when you fail to pay your monthly rent. They can apply that deposit towards monthly rent. If you fail to pay. Number two is if you fail to pay for water, electricity, that kind of, they can apply part of the deposit towards settling those bills. And number three, when you are terminating the lease, the landlord has the right to apply that deposit as part of the proceeds that will be used to return the premises back to the original position. Now, the tenant, on the other hand, has the right to a refund of deposit if they have fulfilled the first three situations that I said. They have paid their rent, all their rent, they have paid all their, what do we call them? So that is electricity and rent. They have paid all their service bills. And number three, at the time of leaving, they have left the premises in their initial position. Then at that point, you have the right to a refund of your deposit.
Okay.
So if any of these three is not met, then the landlord has the right to apply the deposit. If all the three are met, then the tenant has the right to receive their deposit. The problem that we usually have is we have a situation where either the tenant now says they want to sit on deposit and the landlord refuses. In that case, then the landlord will say, what I will do is I will distress for rent. Right? I'll say you have refused to pay rent.
Okay.
In which case then, this person has actually given you notice that I will be leaving. And then at the time that you want to leave, the landlord becomes worried that because you have already sat on your deposit, there is a chance that you will not return the premises back to the original state. Or the money that was supposed to return the premises back to the original state has now been applied to rent. So what happens to returning the premises back to the original state? In that case, they'll tell you that now you ought to paint the premises, you ought to substantially return the premises back to the original state, and then I'll let you go. And that is when you say, you come and say, now at the time that you want to leave, the landlord refuses that you can't leave. Because now they know that if they let you go, then they'll not be able to, they'll suffer the loss of returning the premises to the original state.
Okay.
But what I usually say again, I remember we had a conversation here about mediation. That is when such things also come into play. That you sit down with your landlord and amicably resolve that issue.
Okay.
Because, for example, I do not see why you should insist on sitting on deposit, when this landlord then will, at the end of the day, say, then how do we return the premises back to the original position? On the other hand, I know also we have tenants who insist on sitting on the deposit because they have had a scenario where the landlord has returned the the premises back to the original position and still refused to return the balance of the deposit. So in that case, then they prefer to say, now let us all suffer that loss. Let us meet halfway when we are suffering the loss.
Okay.
But of course, that just creates more trouble than it resolves. So I think sometimes I would say that it is better for parties to try and resolve that amicably rather than fight it out. But for a tenant, I would advise them that if at all the landlord has refused to return your deposit, you have a course of action. Right now we have a court called the Small Claims Court, which allows you to recover debts, because that now becomes a civil debt. It allows you to recover civil debts of less than 1 million shillings in just about 60 days, which I don't think is so much. Unlike a while back when people would say it is very difficult for me to go to court because it will take years, it is very expensive, you know. Right now you go to the Small Claims Court and in 60 days they give an order that the landlord has to return your deposit of 200,000, 100,000, 50,000, whatever, plus the costs of going to court. That only happens in a month, 2 months.
You're done with it.
And you're done with it. So it has become very easy now. Yeah, because those are things that, I know that those are things that have been let go by so many people. In fact, I cannot estimate how much landlords have benefited from
non-refund of deposits.
Non-refund of deposits. At some point, it became a cash cow for them. And they would say, deposit, once I get deposit from you, that becomes my money, whatever the circumstances. That is no longer the position.
I think you've set it out clear. It's very important also for the viewer to understand that due diligence has to be done in regards to the contract you're entering with your landlord as the tenant. And that is where we wind up this particular episode, of course, having told the viewer what they should know in regards to the tenancy law. Of course, it's a wide law. We'll be taking a look at quite other impressive factors in the law and talk about them in our subsequent episodes. But for now,